he has spoken on the topics faith, family and freedom in Cuba, Belgium, Brazil, Congo, UK and all over the USA to crowds from 14 to 40,000. International leadership speaker, trainer and coach. Author of Learn to Raw Leadership, Attitude Hack, Live a More Excellent Life, 5 Battle Strategies of a Victorious Warrior. 2021 President's Lifetime Achievement Award recipient. Founding partner of the John Maxwell team. Toastmaster International Speech Competition semi-finalist. Founder of Tell It Like It Is TV, ThatGuyRocks.com and ThatGuySpeaks.com. Creator of Storypower TV, Transforming Grace TV, and Leading Leaders Podcast. Producer of 4 TV programs and podcasts for Liftable TV and World Trumpet Television as well as multiple social media channels. Please help me welcome J Loren Norris.
I think I was in the 7th grade. First time I heard someone say, maybe it was 8th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade. I don't remember. I remember who said it. It was Arlen Johnson, kid that I was in choir and athletics with. And Arlen said, I come before you to stand beside you to tell you a story I know nothing about. Early one morning, real late at night, 2 dead boys came out to fight. They stood back to back facing each other, and then they drew their swords and shot each other. And if you don't believe my... I forgot that part. Oh, man. How many times have you been a witness to a leader trying to communicate, and the beginning sounds something like that? Let me tell you the truth. A great story needs no introduction. That's what we're going to talk about in this episode of Leading Leaders for Storypower. Stand by. Subscribe now for our extensive video library of leadership lessons promoting faith, family, and freedom. I'm J Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast. I remember the day we set the first fire. Now, we set it on purpose because we were supposed to be training with this fire. We set the fire in a little brick building. We watched the flames begin to engulf the room. The instructor said, don't go yet, don't go yet, don't go yet. We want to let it become fully engulfed. And so when the black smoke began to boil out of the top of the roof, when the flames were lapping up the sides of the building, that's when he told us, now you can turn on your hand line and charge into the building. What he didn't warn us about was that 3 inches of ice on the ground from the water that we had been testing our hoses with before that was already freezing to the concrete beneath us wasn't going to allow us to have any traction the minute we turned on those hoses and 150 gallons per minute started coming out of the end of that hose. That's a lot of pressure. 95-ish PSI. We opened those hand lines and I'll never forget. We did what he told us to. You got to make the circle so that it loops over the top of the hose, because if you don't, if you're just holding that hose, that pressure is going to push you straight back until you lose your balance. But he said you got to make a loop of the hose so that the back part of the hose filled with water is laying over the front part of the hose that you're actually spraying with. That way the weight of that hose will keep it under control for you. You won't be turned over or chasing it. But he didn't tell us that with that much ice on the ground, even the hose isn't going to have any traction. And sure enough, I charged that hand line and threw water into the building, and it took me about 2 minutes to move almost 20 yards backwards. At one point, I wasn't even reaching the building with the water that was coming out of the hose because the traction on the ice, there wasn't any. Now let me take that same illustration just a little bit further for you, because I heard someone just the other day say, there's so much friction in my relationship around finances. And I said, well, I've been married 30 years. We always have friction in our relationship. He's like, oh, I'm so relieved to know that friction in your relationship isn't just me. It's not that I'm doing something wrong. I said, no, don't misunderstand me. This is not about whether you're doing something right or wrong. It's about the laws of gravity. See, I didn't have any friction on that ice. That's why I just kept sliding. But And let me give you another word for friction that's called traction. See, a Corvette, a Lamborghini, a race car doing its very best, performing at its peak performance, racing through the air at, 150, 200 miles an hour. Some of those NASCARs can do 220 miles an hour in a circle. I don't know how that doesn't make you dizzy, but apparently it doesn't. But if they didn't have traction on their tires, when they got to those curves, they'd just fly off into the stands. If they didn't have traction on their tires, they wouldn't have friction. The friction between the ground and the tire is part of the traction equation. How much friction you want, how much traction you want, how much rubber you're going to lose as you're gripping that turn, how much rubber you're going to lose as you take off too hard or spin the tires when you leave. That's why they weave back and forth to keep their tires sticky. What are they looking for? Friction. Why friction? Because friction is traction. I didn't have any friction on the ice with the water hose. It pushed me backwards. I lost my grip. I had no control. If you have no friction in your relationships, my friends, you have no traction. If you have no friction, you have no control. When you see a race car, it has that funny little thing underneath the front bumper. They call it a splitter. It has the one on the back. They call it a spoiler. The one on the front forces the front of the car down. The one on the back forces the back of the car down. And if you take either one of those off, you lose wind friction and aerodynamics, and your car will fly off into nowhere because it doesn't matter how much traction you have. That's linear. That means do you slide left or right when you go around the curves. But there's this law of gravity that says things go down until they don't. When do they don't? Well, when they go fast forward, fast enough. Why do you think you can make a boxcar fly? You think I'm kidding? Ask anybody who's ever worked on an F4. It's a boxcar. It's a giant box with a couple of tiny little wings. Looks like a T-Rex trying to flap its way through the air. But an F4 flies. It flies. Why? Because it goes forward really fast. And if you take a race car and you move it forward really fast and you don't put that splitter on the front and that spoiler on the back, guess what it does? It flies. Formula One race cars have those funny little fins in front of their tires for the same purpose. They have big giant wings on the back for the same purpose. That wing, those fins, those are designed to keep it on the ground. Guess what they do? In the air, in the wind, as they're dividing the wind, they're creating friction. Yep. Creating friction, preventing lift. Because if you get lift, you lose control. If you lose the friction in your relationship, you lose control of your relationship. I'm not trying to be overly technical. I just want you to know that if your boat has no friction, you're parasailing. If your car is driving in the rain and you have no friction, you're hydroplaning. You may find in your relationship you have no friction at all. Everything is smooth sailing, and here's the truth. If both of you can say, we never fight, one of you is suppressing their anger, and the other one's getting away with proverbial murder. Because two humans don't live exactly the same. They have different opinions, different thoughts, different ideas. They always will. And you got to work them out. And sometimes that's small friction. I mean, think of the difference between an emery board that polishes your fingernail, the buffing pad that you use to shine the paint on your car, or the one they use to polish your nails after they've done the polish and the refills and all that good stuff. Compare that to a grindstone that when you put the lawnmower blade, and you see the sparks fly off because that's metal against metal. It's a coarse grit wheel spinning at a very high speed, and you throw that lawnmower blade against it and it literally shaves the metal off of it. Same thing to sharpen a knife. You shave the metal off of it. That's friction. That's painful friction. If you got that kind of coarse friction in your life, that's going to leave scars. But if you've got the kind of friction that buffs a fingernail or buffs a paint job or polishes your china, polishes your steel or your silver, that kind of friction, well, it's necessary to get the highest gloss. It's necessary to get the finest fabrication done. Now, why do I bring all that up? Well, you might notice that I'm only 7 minutes in, and I've given you at least 5 different illustrations of positive application of friction in your relationships. illustrations that you can pull in and say, well, I'm not really a car guy, but I do know about polishing silver. I'm not really a car guy. I don't know anything about race cars or NASCAR or Corvettes racing down the highway, but I get it when you say light friction, like polishing your nails. Well, that's different than having no friction, because if you've ever tried to polish your nails right after you've done some kind of waxing and the polish won't stick, it's the same reason paint won't stick if you don't sand it and then clean all the dust and oil off of it first. It's the same thing. You got to have an adhesive surface, which means it's got to have a little friction in it. And so does your relationship. But see, I've been able to pull all of that through by telling a couple of stories. My story about being on the ice. Well, it sounded first like it was just about a fire, right? No, it was about principles that I learned while fighting fire. And one of those is you got to have friction to have traction. You can't move forward if you have no friction. Because if you have no friction, you have no traction. And it's the same when you're standing on ice, when you're driving on asphalt, driving on snow, driving in sand, or walking through a relationship. If you have no friction, you have no traction. If you have no traction, your relationship's not moving forward. Now, if I had spent 10 minutes, because we're at about 9 minutes now since I started this demonstration and explanation of how a story can be used to bring in multiple analogies and make a point. What's the main point? Without friction, you have no traction. Without traction, you cannot move forward. That's true in your relationships. That's true in polishing your fingernails, polishing your silver, polishing your paint, or driving your race car. It's like the law of gravity. No friction, no traction, no forward momentum. Now you can take that and say, okay, so he talked for about 5 to 7 minutes and he taught a lesson on friction and traction in relationships. What if, though, I had spent 5 minutes before that telling you about when I joined the Air Force and how long it took to get to training and what basic training was like, and none of that had anything to do with sliding on the ice when I turned on the hose? Now, some people, if I didn't put the detail of looping the hose and putting the weight of the hose on top of it, there might be some people who would say, well, it sounds to me like he didn't know what he was doing with the fire hose. But if you know that looping it is what puts the weight on it, that's what's supposed to give you both the support and the leverage and a little bit of traction, a little bit of friction, then you know I've been there, I've done that. It still didn't work out exactly the way it was planned. It didn't do what we thought it was going to do, but there's a lesson to be learned there. See, I find a lot of people, like my friend, I come before you to stand beside you to tell you a story I know nothing about. They want to put this intro in front of the story. Now, I realize that's part of the real humor, if you will, in the story. This early one morning, real late at night, 2 dead boys came out to fight. They stood back to back facing each other, drew their swords and shot each other. The deaf sheriff, he heard this noise. He came and he killed the 2 dead boys. And if you don't believe my story is true, then ask the blind man. He saw it too. But see, a story like that doesn't really carry any merit. It's just designed to be comical, humorous, because it's filled with ironies and impossibilities. The intro is part of the story. But how many people tell a 5 or 10 minute story with a 5 or 10 minute intro that's irrelevant? See, here's what I find with most people. They try to qualify themselves and the story before they start telling the story. They don't start with, we set the fire ourselves. They start with, back in the day when, and I think it was October, no, it was September, no, it was August. Yeah, it was August. Okay, so it was August when I joined the Air Force. And you're thinking to yourself, is that relevant to the rest of the story? I mean, you worked so hard to remember the right time. Was it even relevant to the story? Because the truth is, when I get to the end of the story and the point that I'm trying to make, that you can't have traction without friction, and without friction and traction, you don't move forward. When I joined the military is irrelevant. But if I spent my time and energy confusing you about that date, do you see how much it dilutes the power of the story and the illustration? If I were confused about where I was or who I was with, Would you agree that adds more confusion and complexity to a story that really needs to be simple? It's a really simple illustration, but the story helps solidify the illustration. It's not just an analogy, it's a real life experience that I've been through. If you told me ice is slippery, I would go, yeah, I've lived most of my life in Texas. I don't walk on ice very often, maybe once a year. I don't drive on ice very often at all, because when it ices, we stay home, because that's what we do in Texas. Because if you've seen people in Texas try to drive on ice, you know it's smart to stay home. Your insurance ain't going to cover that. It's just the way it is. So my experience with ice is kind of limited. I've been ice skating one time in my life. Bad idea. My ankles still hurt from that. But the idea of a story that I've lived through, my own experience, my personal experience, setting that in a scene. I'm fighting a fire. I've got the hose. I charge the hand line and I go sliding backwards. Why? Because there's no friction and I got no traction. Now I can take that story into an illustration. So what I'm challenging you to do as leaders is to think of the story that's so good it doesn't need an introduction. You don't have to explain it. You can just start in the middle of the action and tell the story. I was working with a client recently, and the client set out probably what could have been, if I were taking notes, I could have made 5 or 6 bullet points on the 3.5-minute introduction to a 2-minute story. Now the challenge is the point of the story and the details of the introduction had very little connection. And the details of the introduction were a lesson all on their own. They had no relationship to the story, and they had no relationship to the point of telling the story. If you can't conclude your story with a call to action or a very simple premise at the end, which the story supported, if you tell the whole story and then you move into the premise or the call to action or the final idea, without friction, you have no traction. And without traction, you cannot move forward. Now, I can say that in a very short sentence, but somebody might say, well, I thought you didn't want friction in relationships. Okay, let me go back to sliding on the ice. No friction, no traction. Race cars, no friction, no traction. Wings and splitters, no friction, no traction. Car lifts off the ground, no traction on the ground. Car lifts off the ground too far, it goes flying through the air. You have no control at all. In your relationship, in polishing your silver, polishing your fingernails, polishing your paint job, no friction, no traction. It's got to be a little bit of grit, a little bit of abrasion, a little bit of friction to keep your relationship moving forward. If you don't believe that's true, ask yourself about the great relationships that you have. Maybe it's siblings, maybe it's a spouse, maybe it's a coworker. And you'll realize that between the two of you, there have been some arguments that in the moment they got really, really heated and you thought, I'm not even sure why I'm still talking to you. And 10 minutes later, you came back to each other and went, okay, maybe you were right. No, maybe you were right. No, maybe you were right. Okay, maybe we were both right and maybe we were both wrong at the same time. And that's what causes your relationship to continue to go forward. I have 4 kids. I see this constant friction between them all the time. But I tell you what, if they ever had to defend each other, Katie barred the door, because they will. If you say something bad about mom, all of them will jump on you. There's friction, but it's moving forward kind of traction. They rub the fine edges off of each other. Sometimes they rub the coarse edges off of each other. Well, you don't want to break a limb or anything, but sometimes you got to have the grit. You got to have a little friction if you want to have traction to move forward. See, that illustration holds through the entire story and each of the other examples that go behind it. It's not explaining the story, it's expanding the story. It's not introducing the story, it's expanding the story, it's stretching the story. Why? Well, I might call it an avatar window. When you're crafting the story, you're looking for people and going, okay, I know if I'm looking out at this audience and it's 50% women, that there are very few of those who would know what a splitter is or a spoiler is or what it's for or why the grooves on the tire face a certain way. I explained to my wife when we buy tires, I'm like, see these ones that go straight forward? They have no angles out of the rubber. That tread is designed for highway use on a very heavy vehicle because it's not worried about siping water. But on a smaller vehicle, you want to have the tread that goes forward and the ones that go out the side. That's what moves the water when you're driving on a finely wet road, and you want to keep traction even when you're changing lanes. Otherwise, you can hydroplane. Now, if you got a 4x4 like my Suburban, I want to have all-terrain tires on that. I want to be able to have the crisscross pattern that grabs the mud and throws it out the side, that grabs onto rocks and throws them out the side, or throws them under the truck and doesn't just lose traction on it. And so each tread pattern is designed for a little bit of friction, because without it, you have no traction. You following this analogy? But I know most women don't want to get into that kind of detail about tires and traction. So when I say you got to have a little friction to buff those fingernails out, you know, when he does the fill and he leaves that ridge, or she leaves that ridge between the old extensions and the new nail, and you got to fill in that gap in the back by the cuticle, but then you got to polish it out. Otherwise, you just got a ridge of glue sitting there. You got to polish that out. That takes friction. Without that friction, you're not moving forward. You're walking around with ugly fingernails. But if you get them done and then you have that nice smooth finish on it, now you want a little polish on it, guess what? If you don't dust them off after you've polished them, after you've buffed them down, all the grit that's left behind is like sand. It's like dust. You ever danced on a dance floor with sawdust on it? You ever walked on the sidewalk after you've walked in the beach and you got that sand under your feet and you feel like you're walking on ice skates and you stomp your feet a couple of times to get it off because you can't have traction when there's things moving. You can't have proper friction. That grit from buffing your fingernails before you put the polish on, it's a friction reducer. You got to clean that off so that you have true traction between the brush strokes and the fingernail. See, this is all the same story. It's all the same analogy. It's all the same point. Without friction, there's no traction. Without traction, you can't move forward. And it's true in your fingernails. It's true in your buffing your silver. It's true in buffing your car. And it's true in your racing and fighting fire on ice. But that story doesn't need an introduction. I don't need a 10-point explanation before I start telling the story. I remember starting the fire. I remember watching it grow and stepping outside and thinking, we need to put that out, we need to put that out, we need to put that out, we need to put that out. And constantly the trainer was going, not yet, not yet, not yet, not yet, not yet. And when we did begin to fight the fire, I turned on that hose and I lost all traction. I lost all control. It only took me back about 20 yards and I was too far away from the building to hit it with fire. And I learned the lesson, fighting fire on ice. No traction, no friction, no traction. No moving forward. It's really hard to fight the fire with a charged hand line on 3 inches of ice. You can condense that story. So here's my recommendation to you as a leader. If you're a leader and you're telling stories that you have to introduce the story before you tell the story because there's so many details in it, then your story is too complex. If you have to introduce the story in order to build the credibility or to puff yourself up enough for people to listen to your story and go, that made sense to me, work on your story. If you're telling a story and you need an introduction because the audience isn't going to get your story because you made up a story for the wrong audience, tell a better story. And if you feel like you need an introduction because they're just not going to get it because the story is too deep and too complex, tell the better story. And tell that story better. Spend more time with your story. Cut all the fat out. Get rid of the details that aren't relevant. Don't tell them things that don't matter. Cut to the chase. Begin in the middle of the action. Tell a story that's entertaining, that's engaging, and that makes your point for you. And if you need help with that, telling better stories better, that's what I do. I'd be glad to help. I'm J Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast for Tell It Like It Is TV. Have a blessed day.
Loren is a master teacher on storytelling, and I learned so much. I'm really going to have to sit down and go back through everything, and I think I might have to have some more coffees with Loren, but it was totally worth my time, and I really highly recommend it if you're looking to grow your ministry, grow your business, grow your career. Loren will serve you well.